Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody today. My name is Kim Palese. I'm the chairman of Clear Street and recently joined the PPIC Board of Directors, and it's a pleasure to have you all here today. And I'd like to welcome you to the Bechtel Conference Center for this important conversation about California's future. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that we envisioned when PPIC designed this conference center with the support of the Bechtel Family Foundation. The center has been open since March, and already PPIC is using the space to broaden the conversation about critical policy issues in California, from the economy to water policy to healthcare and beyond. And this event is part of the PPIC 2011 speaker series on California's future. And I'd like to thank the sponsors of this series for their underwriting support, and they include the Stewart Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, the Pacific Life Foundation, San Diego Gas and Electric, Union Bank, and Knowledge Partners, McKinsey and Company. The series is also funded by contributions of unrestricted support from PPIC's donor circle. Now, before we get started, two brief requests. First, before you leave today, if you could please take a moment to fill out a confidential survey, which will be by the door, and leave it in the basket next to the exit. And then second, if you could please turn off your cell phones. And now, on to our program. We are so delighted to have Meg Whitman with us today. Meg will begin today's program with some brief remarks about what can be done to spur economic growth in California, and then she'll join PPIC President and CEO Mark Baldassare for a conversation about the current realities and options for a brighter economic future for California. And now it is my honor to introduce Meg Whitman. Last month, I think as we all know, Meg was appointed President and CEO of Hewlett-Packard after joining the board earlier in the year. During her impressive career, she has served in executive roles at many leading companies, including the Walt Disney Company, Procter & Gamble, and Hasbro. And she actually began her career at P&G and then came here to San Francisco early on in her career to work for Bain. So she has deep roots in San Francisco and California. She oversaw tremendous growth and success at eBay, where she served as president and CEO for 10 years, taking the company from just under $5 million in revenues when she arrived to $8 billion in revenues when she left 10 years later, and $2 billion in net income. Just phenomenal achievement. And of course, established eBay as one of the defining companies of the internet age. Meg's commitment to public policy and public service is enduring and includes a run for governor in 2010. And on a personal note, Meg is an inspiration to me. I like the way that A.G. Lafley, the chairman of P&G, Procter & Gamble, put it. Meg doesn't just talk about important values like integrity, authenticity, accountability, and courage. She lives them. And I've seen that during my time knowing Meg. So Meg, welcome. We're so delighted to have you here today and really look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
So first of all, Kim, thank you very much. Kim and I go way back in Silicon Valley. There aren't very many women leaders of companies in Silicon Valley, so we were part of the inner circle in the early days of the internet. So thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you for having me here today. You know, when I accepted this speaking opportunity, I didn't really have a day job. And so, of course, a lot of things have changed in the last week or 10 days. In fact, this is day 8 on the job. But I decided that I wanted to come anyway, because these kinds of conversations are very important. I also think when you make commitments, you need to keep them. So I am just delighted to be here today. And, you know, really, over the last year, I've had an opportunity to be involved in some things that I feel are especially important. And I'm going to talk about some of them today. But first and foremost, it's my passion for education. And we will come back to this. But I've had great fun serving on the board of Teach for America, an amazing organization helping to really create the next generation of teachers for our children. My husband and I, Griff Harsh, have established the Whitman Harsh Family Foundation, which is all about supporting a variety of educational causes. And I'm thrilled about what we hope to accomplish with this family foundation. And now I do see another exciting opportunity with Hewlett-Packard, one of the great American companies. And it is important that Hewlett-Packard thrive, not only to Silicon Valley, but to California, I would argue to the country and the world. So I am delighted to have a chance to lead this company. HP is number 11 on the Fortune's list of the world's largest company. It's the second largest company in California, and in many ways defines the ingenuity and innovation of Silicon Valley. So I'm honored and excited about this next chapter. But really, I wanted to be here today because, like so many Californians, I remain deeply troubled by the issues that drove my desire to enter public service in the first place. And many of those issues, 3 years later, are still with us. And the fact is, we are all investors in California, aren't we? We're all customers of California, and we have a real stake in the future of this state and how well it performs. So what I decided to do about 3 months ago was to bring more focus to the California condition. And I've worked on a couple of different research projects to study California as if it was a business. What would we think about it as customers or shareholders? If we looked at our financial condition, what would we think, and its delivery of services? So I've looked at our financial footing, our competitive posture, and how effectively we use our many resources. But one disclaimer I want to share first. This analysis and my message today are certainly not intended to lay the blame at the feet of any one party or one person. Because as we all know, the problems we face in California have been built up over a long time through many administrations, through many people. And the fact is, they have been coming for a long time. But I also think you always have to look at the past as instructive. But the focus has got to be on where we stand today and what we need to do to turn the ship around. Now, some of the analysis that I'll show you today is quite sobering, but that's not what I want to leave you with today. What's most important is we can fix this. And among the many solutions that we have to do so, there is California's enduring ace in the hole, and that is economic growth and the drive of the people in California. So let's first take stock of what positions California for success, and then we'll look at some of our challenges. Now, as you can see on this slide, this is land mass on the horizontal axis and population on the vertical axis. You can see that California has the largest economy in the United States, the largest population, and the third largest land mass in the United States. We ought to be able to use scale to our advantage. And what I mean by that, being big allows you to do things that smaller states can't do. It allows you to have economies of scale in delivering service and trying out new things. So we ought to be able to use this scale to our advantage. We also have an extremely diverse economy, and we lead the nation in two very important sectors, technology and agriculture. Our higher education system is second to none. Everyone in this room probably knows this. Of the top 15 public universities in the nation, 6 of them are in California. In fact, UC Berkeley and UCLA are number 1 and 2 public university in the entire country. And the diversity of our people is another incredible strength that we have here. You know, when I was at eBay, our tech team was like the United Nations. And at HP, it is no different. We thrive on the diversity that makes California so rich and wonderful. So it's an amazing foundation to work with. And in the years past, all these things have come together to make California the envy of the world. However, right now we do face some pretty significant challenges, and I'll talk about them for the next few minutes. The first major challenge we face is the state's financial condition. A thorough look reveals a staggering amount of long-term debt and negative net worth. California is our home, and the house is underwater. So let's start by looking at California's unfunded liabilities and the debt that we're carrying. If you want to talk about state government's bottom line position, you're looking at it right here, a mountain of debt. The state is upside down by about $400 billion. That's $28,000 for every family in California. I'll start from the bottom up, and I want to begin with the blue bar, which captures all what we call the general obligation bond debt. That debt has soared by 340% since 2001, and today the state is spending a record 8% of general fund expenditures on bond interest costs. That is about $7 billion. So imagine what we could do with that $7 billion if we weren't paying it to service our debt. Think about that, $7 billion to help people in need, $7 billion on education, $7 billion on infrastructure. Instead, we're spending it servicing the debt. And here's the kicker on top of that. California's poor debt rating, the worst in the United States, comparable to Botswana, is costing us millions of dollars more a year to service that debt than if we had a better credit rating. Moving up the bar, the next few colors there, the red, the green, and the purple, cover the state's liabilities for government pensions and health care. From 1999 to 2009, this has exploded by 2,000%. And today, the combined obligations are more than $300 billion of unfunded liabilities. And I've seen other estimates that are far greater, including some that don't include the full impact of the recession and the drop in investment income. And the final piece on the very top there, which hardly anyone ever talks about, is the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which is now in deficit to the tune of $8.5 billion. The unemployment fund is broke. We owe the federal government $8.5 billion. So all of this, if you add it together, has given the state a condition of negative net worth of massive proportions. And absent any change, this will temper the aspirations of our government indefinitely. Okay, so we've taken a look at the debt and unfunded liabilities. Now, if that weren't enough, we have a huge structural deficit to contend with. Incredibly, most Californians, maybe some of you in this room, are under the impression that the state budget gets balanced every year, and that it just takes a lot of time and back and forth in Sacramento. And yet, year after year, we see the budget out of balance soon after it's signed, occasionally when the ink is still wet. And that's for the most part because the solutions are not real. For the past decade, the state government's ongoing structural deficit, this is important, defined as predicted revenue minus promised spending, has been between $5 and $20 billion a year. Now, while there have been some real spending cuts, most often the gap has been bridged with just about every scheme and maneuver in the book. Borrowing from financial markets, borrowing from special funds, borrowing from local government, borrowing from the federal government, one-time federal stimulus dollars, borrowing from the K-12 education funds, gimmicks, my favorite, like moving the state payday one day ahead so it moves into the next fiscal year, increasing fees and taxes short-term or on a one-time basis, and padding the budget with anticipated revenue that may or may not occur. I think you get the picture why we still have a fundamental structural deficit in this state. Now, compounding the problem further, and on top of all the debt, unfunded liabilities and structural deficits, is the instability of the state's main sources of revenue. State government's primary revenue stream, quite different than many other states, is personal income taxes, which account for more than 55% of the general fund revenues. It's there in blue, and it's highly volatile. In 2007, nearly half of California's personal income tax collections and a quarter of all general fund revenues came from 144,000 taxpayers out of 37 million people in California. 2 years and a recession later, they contributed less than 40%, not because their tax rates were cut, but because they had significantly less income. And California's budget paid the price. We all know that the state's heavy reliance on capital gains has put us in a bind time and time again. The latest swing from 2007 to 2009 saw capital gains drop from 12% of our general fund to just 4% of the general fund. So how in the world do you plan for a future with a system tied to this kind of volatility? And you know who it affects most of all is our schools. In my role as Teach for America, August 1st, the school districts in this state are still trying to figure out how many teachers they can hire. But here's one last thing that I want to mention, something that hit me like a Mack truck as I was doing this analysis. I actually knew it, but I didn't realize the magnitude of the problem, and that is our reliance on the federal government. This slide shows that the funding we receive from the federal government, the bar in blue, is nearly as much as our entire general fund budget, shown here in green. Think about that for a minute. The money we get from Washington is almost as much as our entire general fund revenue in the state of California. Holy smokes. I mean, I don't know about you, but my view is that contribution from the federal government, I don't think that number is going up anytime soon. I bet it's going down, and maybe by a lot. If we experience just a 10% cut from the federal government, that's $8 billion. Imagine another $8 billion hole in the federal government. It mostly covers Medicaid and Medicare, what we call Medi-Cal in California. But those are people out there who are depending on those services. And I think there's a very good chance we're going to see a pretty significant cut from the feds. Okay, now that I have brightened your day with an up-close and perilous look at our state's financials, let's review California's unemployment situation. We all know we're in a tough situation here. Right now, our unemployment rate is the second highest in the country at 12.1%, only below Nevada. We have a higher unemployment rate than Michigan. Did you ever think that California would have a higher unemployment rate than Michigan? And over the past 5 years, even though we have 13% of the nation's population, we've accounted for 25% of all the mass layoff events in the United States of America. In manufacturing alone, we have lost 600,000 jobs over the past decade, 1/3 of our entire manufacturing base. And here's the scary thing about this. In business, when your revenues take a severe dip, you can compensate by cutting costs. But often, government doesn't have this option, and it becomes a double whammy. So while your unemployment rates are going up, the cost to take care of people who need your services go up at the same time your revenues are going down. And it's very evident. You've got to cover the increase in costs of the unemployed while you have decreased revenues because you have so many people that are not working. It has a brutal impact on the budget. But I also think it shows that unbreakable link between a strong economy and strong financials. As I mentioned earlier, the state's unemployment fund is underfunded by nearly $8.5 billion. Either the state makes up this difference or cuts benefits, or they compel employers to cover it through higher payroll taxes. But no matter what, we owe that money to the United States government, and the feds, in my view, are probably not likely to forgive that debt. But we can get out of this mess, even with modest reductions in unemployment. If we move the dial by just a percentage point from 12.1% to where it is now to about 11%, we'd have another 180,000 Californians on the job, along with a score of revenue benefits, more than $1 billion in unemployment fund savings, and another $1 billion or more in personal income taxes and healthcare savings. In fact, if we got unemployment down from 12% to 8%, where we have had many, many times in California, we would have 720,000 more working Californians with $4.3 billion in unemployment fund savings and $4 billion more in personal income tax and healthcare savings. The leverage in our financial situation of decreasing unemployment cannot be understated. So what this shows is we have an incredible motivation to foster economic growth. But the fact is, we're not doing a very good job of that in California. In fact, we are driving out innovation, we're driving out businesses, we're driving out manufacturers because of the high cost of doing business here, some of the highest tax rates in the country, and suffocating regulations. Now, I know there are many people who like to say, it's not true, businesses are not leaving California. I want to say just as emphatically, they are leaving California. Some companies keep their headquarters here. Most companies keep their headquarters here. But when the time comes to expand, as those enterprises grow and add workers, they often choose to do it elsewhere. And it is killing the state's bottom line. Every day, businesses like HP are besieged under rules and cost factors that literally decide for us where growth is possible. Looking at just a few examples in Silicon Valley, it is really, really troubling. One of Santa Clara's biggest homegrown success stories is now the largest private employer in Oregon, with 15,000 employees in Oregon. If those jobs had stayed in California, the state would earn $120 million or more a year in additional tax revenue. Other Silicon Valley companies are now spending $2 billion on new data centers in North Carolina, denying us more than $100 million in revenue. And still another is building a new tech campus in Utah that will employ over 1,000 people. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. In California, those 1,000 new jobs in Utah would have given us $200 million in additional tax revenue over the next 20 years. These are not hypotheticals. This isn't speculation. This is the world we live in here. And we can't afford, in my view, to let hubris and the high regard for California's historical appeal numb our senses to the point that we can't see how we're discouraging job creation. Next, I want to spend just a moment on some of the challenges we face with education. Its importance is obvious to everyone here. The single most significant investment we make in our state and our future is education. K through 12 per pupil funding has fallen relative to other states and is now well below the national average, something you often hear Republicans say, but it's true. What's more, California is among the worst performers in getting education dollars into the classroom. Only about 60% goes to the classroom, while 40% of our education dollars goes to administration and overhead. If you ran your business with 40% administration and overhead, what would happen? You would be out of business. And using the best data available to compare student performance from the U.S. Department of Education, California 8th graders rank 47th in math proficiency, ahead of only Alabama, Mississippi, and Washington, D.C. And our 8th graders rank 49th in reading, ahead of only Washington, D.C. Now take a look at this, something else that's very troubling. Trends show that of the 510,000 high school freshmen last year, only 3/4 will graduate from high school. Only 1/4 of those 510,000 freshmen will have the credits to attend a UC or a CSU school. Only 13% will enroll in a CSU or UC school, and just 7% will earn a degree there within 6 years. This indicates the remarkably poor readiness among even our high school graduates to get to the next level and be successful. And looking at the trends nationally, it's positively frightening. By 2020, about 2/3 of the jobs in America are going to require post-secondary education. But it's estimated we'll have a shortage of college-educated workers to the tune of 3 million people, and a total of 6 million high school dropouts on the unemployment rolls. It's so senseless and it's so tragic because we know that education delivers a terrific return on investment. Income and unemployment track predictably with educational attainment, and the trends are taking us towards a world with more dropouts, heavier demands on public assistance, and a cavernous skills gap in the workforce, which is especially problematic for us because of our dependency on the technology sector. Now, of course, business can be a part of this solution, and I'm very proud of the work that HP has done to bring greater attention and resources to this achievement gap, particularly in science, technology, and engineering and math. And I'm delighted that our foundation has been able to support Summit Charter Schools in Silicon Valley, where they graduate every single one of their students college ready. And through their corridor, which they're calling the Silicon Valley College Ready Corridor, Summit will be expanding from 1,300 students to 6,000 students through 10 new high schools over the next 10 years. All right, let's move on. We've looked at our finances and our future, and there's a lot of bad news, all pointing to the obvious conclusion. California needs a turnaround. And to make this happen, we all know that we've got to overturn a broken political system that's not interested in California being competitive or efficient. But let me tell you, California can be turned around. There is a blueprint of simple solutions that can deliver lasting recovery for our state. I'll talk about government efficiency for just a moment, then budget reform, and then finally the real weapon, growing the economy. So first, some of you might be thinking to yourselves, here's Meg again, talking about making government run more like a business, right? Well, you bet. Because everyone knows that there are inefficiencies here. and the savings can make a real difference. At the state level, it's been done to a considerable degree in states like Indiana, for instance, and it's happening in other states as well. And the fact is, California's begun to do some of this. As part of this year's budget, the state achieved $471 million in employee compensation and operational efficiencies, which is all great. But you don't just look for savings to avoid spending cuts. It should be a matter of routine to give California taxpayers their money's worth. Think about this for a minute. If the state government could find just 10% efficiency over the next few years, it could save $12 billion. Anyone who works in a business knows full well you can find 10% efficiency. But maybe it's too disruptive for government? I don't think so. But okay, 5%. That's $6 billion. That's still a lot of money to reduce our debt, to close the structural deficit, to invest in infrastructure, or something else. With that $6 billion, we could hire another 88,000 teachers. So how is this not worth the effort to go after these efficiencies? And you know what? We're incredibly well positioned to do so. With global leaders in cloud computing, energy management, and other technologies right here in our own backyard, shouldn't we leverage those assets to make California more competitive and more efficient? And on top of those efficiencies, the state can also find savings by rooting out some of the wasteful spending in the budget. Some of these savings, for example, can be found rather easily among the 426 so-called special funds, which have been put into existence through our proposition process. And there are some real winners in here, like the Payphone Service Providers Committee Fund and the Car Wash Worker Restitution Fund. How in the world did this happen? Even if there is a real need for some of those monies, shouldn't that be part of a normal budgeting process? You cannot have 426 special funds that are identifying these tiny needs. Now, they don't have a lot of money, some of them, but my view is every dollar counts and we have to go after it because it is the taxpayers' money. All right, the next solution is to look at spending reform. And I guess this is another line that everyone's heard 1,000 times. We don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. But listen, sometimes a cliche is a cliche for a reason. People say it because it's true. And in this case, there's absolutely no doubt about it. State government's construct for spending, with all its formulas and limitations and mandates, is simply mad. For instance, if we do nothing, health care spending alone will crowd out everything else in the state budget. There won't be a dime to pay for schools or roads or public safety or anything else. But let me drill down on the big issue here. Something we've learned from the California experience is that the roots of fiscal disaster are likely to be found in good times, not in bad. Reckless permanent commitments made when the economy was up created huge structural deficits that have dogged us for years. And there is one reason, a very significant reason, why we need a measure in place that will limit the growth of spending from each year to the next. I think there's a way to do this responsibly and compassionately. Now, I'm using a formula here that's been proposed many times before. Align annual spending increases to inflation plus population growth. If we had placed such a limit on spending growth in 1997, California finances would be near impeccable. So this would be the growth of spending. Annual spending growth would have averaged 4%, and with the revenues we'd collected, we would have run a surplus in every year except for 2008 and a small deficit in 2009. Said another way, instead of running deficits for much of the past 15 years, with the spending limit, we'd have run surpluses. Even the roughly $4 billion deficit in 2008 would be dwarfed by the nearly $12 billion in average surpluses from 1997 to 2007. We'd have taken the Great Recession in stride, and today we'd have an enormous reserve fund to protect future year spending. Most importantly, lawmakers would be starting every year with a debate about what to do with the surpluses, not a painful debate about how to close a perpetually mammoth deficit. Imagine that whole switch in how Sacramento works. So I ask you, how is it that steady spending growth of 4% and a funding environment that allows government to deliver services while planning for future needs is somehow worse than a few windfall years of higher spending increases that come with years of disruptive, painful cuts and tax increases. Now, I know that it's hard to believe that politics would allow such a huge reserve to build up and to fund annual increases to a set limit. But everyone agrees we need to protect government spending against the up and down cycle of the economy, and this is how we can do it. So I've talked about government efficiency and spending reform. Let me address a third solution, and it is the most powerful tool we have to fix our finances, put people back to work, and secure a more stable future for our kids, and that is economic growth. The takeaway here is the deep and far-reaching impact of economic growth on everything we want to achieve, and the impact is much greater than most people realize or appreciate. It is that virtuous cycle of economic growth and job creation, which leads to healthy revenue generation for the state, which leads to debt reduction and deficit elimination, and all the while driving progress and stabilizing our finances. But right now, economic growth, the mother of California's aspirations and her lifeline, is merely a goal in the conduct of public policy here. It is not the priority. Priorities are the first vocations of public service: educating our kids, assisting the poor, tending to the ill and the elderly, building our roads, policing our streets. These are all critical, no doubt. But the problem is lawmakers generally do not judge themselves at all by how they impact the economy and employment. But how can they exclude from their self-assessment economic growth, the one thing that makes all those other priorities possible? I shared with you earlier a few examples of where the state has lost hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue because of government policies that drove business elsewhere. From a broader perspective, look at the benefits to all of us when we keep that growth here at home. Growing the economy, which means increasing the GDP growth rate and decreasing unemployment, gives us enormous financial leverage. If we grow GDP 1%, it brings us $1 billion or more in new tax revenue. And that doesn't include increased returns from corporate taxes and capital gains. And on top of that, as I mentioned earlier, we get the benefits to the unemployment fund savings of another $1 billion. And really, something we don't talk about much is the multiplier effect, that chain reaction of economic activity that growth unleashes. So when you get GDP growth, you trigger more tax revenues from corporations and from individuals. But you also get more people making more money, maybe getting a raise at work, buying more and consuming more, maybe even starting a new business and in turn hiring people. It's a compound effect of amazing scale, and it takes the state a long way towards balance. You know what? If this unvarnished bottom line look of the California enterprise could trigger just one response from our elected leaders, I'd want them to know this: to fully understand that the power of growing the economy and reducing unemployment has in fixing our debt and deficit. The number one thing we can do to get us out of this fiscal mess is grow the economy. The leverage is enormous. And then we might be able to invest in more programs, in more essential government services. The fact is, the government has powerful tools at its disposal to use whenever it wants. Tax relief, tax reform, regulatory reform, innovation in education, all things that don't require that California cut to the bone. So let's take a quick look at taxes. Right now, our business and personal income tax rates are among the nation's highest. As I discussed earlier, too often we see business achieve success and put themselves in a position to expand. But they expand someplace else because the tax rate and the cost factors are too much to bear. California needs lower tax rates on businesses and investment because the rates right now are making us less competitive. And it's not merely a question of rates. It's sometimes a question of tax policy that offers more certainty and a level playing field. Lower taxes are not about helping the rich. They're about maximizing tax revenues. I need to also mention regulations here as well, because for many companies that grow someplace else, this is even a bigger reason than taxes. What's more, right-sizing our regulatory scheme also has its own multiplier effect. LAO data shows that last year, state government spending on regulations was $1.7 billion. Now, if we concede that some of those regulations are necessary for reasons of public interest, I submit many of them are not. For example, many of us have been urging CEQA reform for some time now, and I was especially encouraged to see Governor Brown recently approve CEQA relief for the LA Stadium project and other large enterprises in the state. This acknowledgement that CEQA can be a barrier to job creation is a really good sign, and we need to see more of this if we want to get this economy moving again. We can at least do what has been proposed many times before, require a review of the cost impact of regulatory proposals versus the intended benefit. But most important, what business needs, as in the case of tax policies, is an overriding approach from lawmakers and bureaucrats that calms the fear of uncertainty that hinders private investment and job creation. This assessment of California certainly finds us with some daunting challenges, doesn't it? Deep, long-term debt, negative net worth, policies that discourage economic growth. The magnitude of the problems are worse than most Californians realize, requiring action much bolder and more lasting than what the political environment will allow right now. But I have great confidence in our capacity to turn things around, and I will tell you why. California's private sector is hurting right now. It has endured so much. A global meltdown, fewer consumers buying products, a decline in business-to-business purchasing, higher taxes, regulatory overreach, and more. But against this tide, it continues to move forward. What power we see in the drive and determination of our public sector, the desire to engineer the future. It is still at the heart of who we are as a state and a people. We want to lead. We want to be on that frontier of discovery for every era and every generation. So imagine what we can do, what we can accomplish when our economic engine finds a true partner in government. You know, one of the skills I've been able to develop in my years in business is what I call pattern recognition, a sense of which enterprises have real potential, what makes for a successful business. And I can tell you, California is not a speculative venture. At its core, it is a sound product with all the ingredients to be successful, to be, again, an economic titan. You know, during the campaign, I was very fortunate to have experienced a California few have seen. Everywhere, up and down the state, meeting folks from all walks of life, nearly 800 visits and gatherings over 2 years. Hardworking people, builders, inventors, creators, all possessing the same values as generations of workers and entrepreneurs before them. They all define California exceptionalism, with a taste for adventure, a capacity for rebirth, and a passion for incredible achievements. When they are empowered, they will succeed. And their success will accelerate this virtuous cycle of growth and recovery and investment in California. We can do this, but it is going to take a new partnership between business and government to get ourselves out of this and onto the path that every single person in this room wants. So thank you very much for inviting me.
To our audience, I know that there are a lot of people who have questions and are eager to hear from you. And let me just say that I'm delighted to see you working in the public policy arena. It's very important that we have business leaders who have a vision of what a government and business relationship might look like, and we really value that. Let me start out by asking you a question about your new role as CEO and the perspective that you bring with having served as CEO successfully at eBay for so many years. This is a time of great uncertainty where the environment seems to be changing almost on a daily basis. And it's a time also where you've identified a need for that we have to be able to plan and chart a course of action and maintain that course. Both as you approach your new job at HP and as you think more broadly about how we in California need to chart a course, what are your suggestions for how we maintain a course and plan for the future?
great at adapting to changes in the environment if you know that this is going to be that way for a while. We can almost take anything. Oh, do you want me to turn it on now? How's that? Is that better? There we go. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Sorry about that. So what I was saying is businesses are tremendously adept at adjusting to circumstances. Uncertainty is not our friend in business because when things are constantly changing, the only thing you can do is plan for the worst. And that leads to a pulling back in a way that is not healthy for the overall economy. So whether it was eBay or HP, we are plotting a strategic course. We're being relatively conservative because it is not just the US that is facing uncertainty. There is real challenges in Europe right now. So you're thoughtful, you're more conservative, and yet continue, obviously, particularly in the tech sector, you have got to continue to invest in innovation or you will be left behind. So it is a very difficult environment, particularly for a company the size of HP. So I am optimistic, but it is, there's some real challenges out there. And with regard to California, I think I pretty much covered it in the speech. If we could form a partnership between the needs of private enterprise and the government sector here and grow this economy, it will decrease the unemployment rates, increase the growth of revenues to the government, so we are not constantly in this situation of cutting to balance 15 years of structural deficits. As I said, the number one leverage in improving our fiscal situation in California is economic growth.
So let me follow up on that for a moment. One thing that we heard from your talk is the importance of economic growth for the revenues that we can bring into the state. And one thing that's on the minds of Californians today is they want to see more jobs. They want to feel more secure about the job that they have. So let's talk about job creation for a moment in California. We certainly hope that in your role at HP, you're going to be creating some jobs in California for us. And what are the unique strengths and weaknesses in terms of attempting to create jobs in California today?
Yeah. Well, the great strength, of course, is the people of California. This ingenuity, innovation is in our DNA. And by the way, Silicon Valley and San Francisco is the very best part of that. If you travel to other parts of California, we're living in a little bit of a bubble here right now. I mean, I don't mean bubble in a bad way. I mean, the economy in San Francisco and Silicon Valley is really quite good now, but you drive 30 miles to the east or 70 miles to the southeast, and it is not the same. So don't get too comfortable here because it is not as good in other places. So what could we do about that? I mean, first is we were rated 48th out of 50 states in overall business climate by the big business magazines. That's a function of regulation, it's a function of taxes, it's a function of government attitude towards the private sector. We were rated 44th worst in lawsuit abuse. Last year, 1.4 million lawsuits were filed in California. Some of them frivolous, some of them not. But a lot of companies don't expand here because it is the most difficult place to defend frivolous litigation in the country. Taxes. There are some things we could do. Factory tax, for example. Remember I mentioned we'd lost 600,000 manufacturing jobs? We're one of only 3 states that taxes the equipment that manufacturers buy to manufacture in the state. So if you just move to Nevada with a big printing press that can cost $1.5 million, you don't pay the sales tax on that in a neighboring state. The little thing, $800 LLC fee. If some of you are thinking about starting your own business, the very first thing you have to do before you bill a single client or produce a single service is you have to pay the state $800. For little companies, that's a lot. They have to think, wow, boy, how long is it going to take me to earn that $800 back? Regulations. I talked about some of it. This economic cost benefit of regulations, if the legislature would take this up, it would pay enormous dividends. What is the benefit, the public good we get from these regulations, and what is the cost, and are we on that balance in so many regulations? The answer is probably not, but I think that could make a big difference here. I'd say, you think about labor laws and workplace flexibility. There's a lot of restaurant chains that are no longer expanding in California because of meal and rest regulations and overtime. We're one of a handful of states that if you work 10 hours a day, 4 days a week, that's 40 hours. You would think, actually, that you would not pay overtime as the employer. We're one of a handful of states that if you work more than 8 hours a day, even if you only work 40 hours in the week, you pay overtime. And you know who this really hurts? It hurts working women. Because I have so many friends who would love to work 4 days a week, 10 hours a day, so they could spend, say, Saturday, Sunday, Monday with their families. It's uneconomic to be that kind of employee in California. These are the kinds of things, and there's no silver bullet, Mark. This is blocking and tackling, figuring out, what are the things we can live without? How do we, on the margin, make this state competitive? Because if we can just make it a little easier to do business here, everyone wants to live in California. Everyone wants to live here. So if we could just make it a little easier and as an employer not feel dumb for not moving manufacturing out of the state, for example, I think there's a very bright future.
Can we go back to tax reform for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of proposals that are in the works right now to look at broadening the tax base, lowering the tax rates base, going to consumer tax, a consumption tax. So what are your thoughts about what would be the best situation tax-wise in terms of job creation in California today?
So I've thought a lot about this, and it is the right, I think, conceptual idea to broaden the tax base. Remember I said there's 144,000 taxpayers who account for 50% of the personal income tax in the state of California. 25% of the entire revenue of the state is brought by 144,000 people. If one of those 144,000 people moved to Nevada, where there's no state income tax, that is a huge loss for us. But if you're going to broaden the tax base, that means taxes have to go up on somebody, doesn't it? So my view is, at the moment, we would be better off with a spending cap. Let's get a spending cap in place. Let's say we want to grow spending at inflation plus population. As a business person, I'd like to add a productivity factor, meaning you have to get better at what you do every single year. I don't think that would necessarily pass muster. So let's just go with inflation plus population. That is the way to mitigate these big swings in revenue so that you can build up a surplus that you can spend in a rainy day. So in the end, we need tax reform. This is an almost impossibility, it would seem, in Sacramento. So let's start with a spending cap, get ourselves back on good financial footing, which may allow people to breathe more deeply and then be able to tackle tax reform in not such an emotional environment.
Well, it's clear from both your briefing slides and when we spoke a year ago when we came to your offices to talk about the issues facing California, that education is something that you've given a lot of thought to, and now it's something that you've been involved in philanthropically. You had some slides about K through 12. You demonstrated the high value that our public higher education system provides to the state. What do you see as what we ought to be doing immediately in the area of education, K through 12 and higher ed, that's going to make a difference for our economy?
Well, first of all, I think we as Californians have to admit we have a real problem in our hands. At almost every event that I speak at, and I mention, that we are 47th out of 50 states or 49th out of 50 states in reading and math, there is usually a gasp in the room. Because I don't think California really understands how bad it has become. Back in the 50s, we had among the very best public school systems in the country. So we first got to say, this is an issue, and how can we work together to save this next generation of children? And there is a huge imbalance, as I showed, between the skills that are going to be required for the next generation of workers versus the skills that these kids are being equipped with. So I spent a lot of work in the context of my foundation trying to figure out where the real leverage is, because a lot of philanthropists have broken their pick on education. And I sort of picked really 3 areas. First is teachers. In the end, great teachers in the classroom make all the difference. Think about your own children. When did they do the best? They did the best when they had a great teacher. So that's why I've decided to invest in Teach for America. They are generating a whole new group of young, smart people who want to go into the teaching profession. But here's the real leverage. The Teach for America alumni, 65% of them stay in the education field. They're principals, they're superintendents, they run for public office. So all of a sudden you've got a huge alumni network that is reform-minded because they came in through a Teach for America career path. Second is charter schools. Charter schools are not perfect. Some charter schools are not as good as they should be, but the vast majority of charter schools do a better job, and it's for a simple reason. They have more degrees of flexibility. The principal is not burdened by the bureaucracy. They have the ability to put the teachers in at those schools who they think will do the very best job, and they have the opportunity to innovate in those schools. So charter schools, the data suggests that they are very, very effective. So I've decided to invest in more and more charter schools. One of the reasons I'm so excited about Summit Prep is that if we can get to 14 charter high schools in Silicon Valley, about 2 out of every 5 students in high school in Silicon Valley will be in a charter school. I don't know. I think that might be a tipping point, right? Once you get 2 out of every 5, that puts, pressure on the other schools. Parents are kind of excited because they see their kids maybe in those charter schools doing great. And then, so those are really the teachers and the charter schools. And then, of course, science and technology and engineering math. You know what? We learn. I've been to many, many schools in the context of the governor's race and my family foundation. Most kids are learning in schools today the same way we did. Paper textbooks, paper workbooks, one teacher at the front of the class, everyone getting the same thing. What's gone on in Silicon Valley? It's all about personalization, isn't it? We have got to customize education for different learning styles for different kids. And there's some real breakthroughs going on in technology. One I'm pretty fond of, which is the Mind Research Institute, teaches K through 5 kids a new way to learn math with computer supplements to the classroom. It is simply remarkable. At Anderson Elementary School down in East San Jose, these statistics aren't quite right, but about 15% of the second graders were proficient in math before Mind Research Institute. Now it's 85%. So there are some really interesting, fun things going on there. And I think I sort of feel like maybe education's at a tipping point, but it's going to take all of us.
Yeah, I was interested in what wasn't included in your presentation today also, and I'd like to go over this with you. When we first talked 3 years ago at the Commonwealth Club, transportation, infrastructure were thematically there, and actually last year when we met during the campaign, we gave you a briefing on water and infrastructure. And have those gone down in importance in your mind, or where does that fit in?
There's no question that California needs an investment in infrastructure, water being one, ports being another. But if you look at this financial situation and you look at the general obligation bonds and the debt we are carrying, the pensions, the healthcare retiree costs, and the unemployment funds, my view is before we take any more debt on, we have got to start getting our financial house in order. So it's a choice.
And then education spending before transportation and infrastructure.
Listen, that would be my choices. We are in a situation that we face very tough choices. We cannot have everything we want or need in the state right now. And so my view would be, let's get the economy growing, let's get our fiscal house in order, let's do the things that I described in that presentation, which will then put us in a situation where we can invest again from a capital point of view. Listen, I, as you know, was a big supporter of the water bond. We need an alternative water conveyance system. We need more above and below ground storage. But we are in a situation where we cannot have everything we want or need right now. And I just think to go and layer on another big chunk of debt onto this state, we're already spending $7 billion in interest payment. Anyone here want to spend $8 billion? I just think, these are hard choices that have to be made. It's not pretty, but first things first. When you are in a turnaround situation, it is all about choices you make and how to get back to financial health as fast as you can.
I want to ask my last question, then we'll turn it back to the audience about presidential politics. When we met 3 years ago, you were working with the McCain campaign in their economic advisory group. You're obviously involved with Mitt Romney, as you had been before you worked with McCain. What are you hearing at the national level and in presidential politics that's different this time around than what you heard in the 2008 election? And what is there that's sort of caught your attention in terms of the theme of the economy and job creation? And what are you hearing that from a business perspective you think this is different and important?
Well, as you think back to the primary of 2008, you'll remember, it's hard to remember, but you'll remember the biggest issue in that primary was the surge in Iraq. Were we going to double down? How were we going to get ourselves out of Iraq? What was going to happen? And that was the biggest issue of the day. It was not until about this time in 2008 where Lehman went under and we began to go into an economic, very challenging situation. Since that time, the economy has not gotten much better. In fact, I would argue that it has gotten worse. And so now jobs and the economy has become the #1 issue. But boy, I understand politics probably better, certainly than I did before I ran, which is the issue of the day can change at almost any moment. The issue of the day right now is economy and jobs. And I think, Mitt Romney, who I've known for many, many years, is incredibly well positioned in that environment. But we are, 14 months out from the election. But I think we face real economic challenges in this country, real challenges of competitive, versus other countries in the world. And I suspect this will be the main issue. And I think that's appropriate given where we are.
Are there new ideas or solutions that you're hearing this year that you didn't hear 3 years ago?
Listen, there's a lot more solutions, a lot more focus on this than there was 3 or 4 years ago. I would say, 80, you guys watch this more closely than I do, but 80% of the policy discussions seem to be focused around the economy. While, certainly 4 years ago that was not the case. Whenever there is a laser-like focus on jobs, the economy, government spending, there's all these really interesting ideas that percolate up. So I think that's incredibly healthy. And obviously a lot of different points of view on how to get the economy going. But the debate in and of itself, I think, is very healthy.
Terrific. Well, let's ask our audience if they have some questions. Peter?
Have you talked to your fellow Republicans in Sacramento since the election? And if so, what are you telling them about the agenda that you've been talking about?
Yeah. Only on an informal basis. I have not been up there sort of roaming around. Standing on a street corner. Listen, the talk that I gave today is what I tell people when they are interested in understanding my perspective, which is people have underestimated the depth of the financial challenge we face at this state. I mean, the one slide that I hope everyone can take away is that years and years of structural deficit. What that means is we have fundamentally not changed the revenue equation and the cost structure of the state of California. And unless we decide to do that, we're going to be in this cycle year after year after year. So I have talked about the leverage that you get from a decrease in unemployment, the leverage you get from a 1% increase in GDP. And so that's what I talk about all the time. And when asked.
Should they be compromising on at least putting taxes on the ballot in order to get regulatory reform, for example?
Yeah. So my view at this juncture is, and I know it's a cliche, as I said, my view is we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. And if we could get our spending under control, fundamentally restructure how we spend money in the government, we are going to be better off by not raising taxes, because back to that notion that the biggest leverage we have is economic growth. If we can get more companies here, keep more companies here, reduce that unemployment rate. Think about that. Going from 12% to 8% is 720,000 more Californians working, paying taxes, and not needing to rely on the public service. It is a wonderful effect to get this economy going. And I don't think raising taxes actually helps that long-term objective.
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Crystal Brown, and I'm a parent, public school parent in San Francisco. And there are a couple statistics that you gave that, well, first of all, let me back up and say thank you so much for coming and being here and speaking to all of us, and everything you said is really important. And I appreciate your dedication to education. And there's a few things. So I started a parent-led campaign. It's kind of like Mothers Against Bad Schools in California. We have, that's not what we really wanted to call it. We wanted to call it something else.
It has a ring to it, though.
It's called Educate Our State. But what we really have dove in, and actually PPIC has been very helpful in looking at statistics. And a couple of things you said, I really wanted to bring up. One is that if we were to get to the national average for public school spending per pupil, it's about $25 billion that we would need. So we're so far from where we need to be. And since you have a lot of you're in a position where you can have a lot of influence on what happens in the state. One of the things that's really come up is that we don't have a special interest group that's in Sacramento that's fighting on behalf of children, only children. And so what I worry about when I hear you talk about charter schools, for example, it confuses the message because 95% of the children are not in charter schools. And so I just hope that that's on your radar, in addition to the fact that the administrative statistic bothered me, because I just want to make sure that the public understands that administration pays for special needs children and transportation like school buses and to keep the lights on and the water running for some of these schools. So that kind of a statistic makes it look like it's all being wasted, which doesn't really help the cause of getting more money to schools.
We'll take that as a question.
Yeah.
Hopefully, an answer for others. Please keep your. Let's have questions. Yes.
Yeah. So listen, we can do better than getting 60% of the money into the classroom. We can do better. There are states who do better than we do on that notion. Part of the issue is how many school districts we have in the state of California. We have an enormous number of school districts that harken back to when we were an agricultural economy and when it was very hard to travel from, Sacramento to San Francisco. And the massive numbers in San Jose alone, we have 28 school districts. Each of those school districts carry overhead. So it is politically very challenging to think about collapsing school districts, but the fact of the matter is structurally, we are in a position where a lot of money goes to overhead and the real money needs to be in the teachers in the classrooms. I would say the reason that I am a fan of charter schools is charter schools are leading the way. It is remarkable when you take a like group of kids and they go to a charter school versus a regular public school, almost uniformly, they do better. And you can't ignore that data. So if we could get more kids, more than 5%, imagine if we could have 25% of kids in charter schools. It seems to me that you get to a tipping point where all of a sudden the entire education establishment and every parent says, holy smokes, we have a better alternative here. And then maybe that starts to sort of crack open the entrenched interest in education.
Thank you. Question here?
Yeah, I heard you talking about private industry and public partnership to make California going forward. I'm running a company. I like real solutions because now I see you mentioned those kind of nitty-gritty taxes and lack of service. So for people cannot register company easily. For me to register company, I need to go to Sacramento a couple of times and waste a lot of time and the $800, all these things, plus like a lot of regulation. Kind of like, did you see, you're talking about partnership, did you see a real vehicles we can participate to get something going?
Okay, that's a good question.
Yeah. So I think this has to start from a point of view in Sacramento that we want to be a more business-friendly state than we are. And then you start and you say, what is the most leveraged things that we can do? We can do tax reform. We can do regulatory relief and regulatory streamlining. I would argue that that is an easier thing to tackle right now than taxes.
Yes.
Everyone, I think, could agree that it is hard to start a business here. We don't rank well in terms of regulatory burden versus other states. So I would just love to see the powers that be in Sacramento say, you know what, we're going to have a focused effort on streamlining regulation. Let's keep those regulations that are a real public benefit, but how can we streamline it and make it easier? And gosh, you've got state, county, and city regulations as well, which make it even more complicated. But again, when you want to make change, you've got to focus on something. And I would argue we could make an enormous difference to the economic climate in California if we were really to look at the cost-benefit analysis, how long these regulations are around. We never sunset. We never met a regulation we don't like. And,
Recall those regulations.
so could we, in the perfect world, you'd love to start in zero-base world, meaning if we had no regulations today, what would we put in knowing what we know? Very difficult from a political point of view. But I promise you, we would get halfway home on economic growth if we fix the lawsuit environment here and the regulatory environment.
Fantastic. We have to have some other questions, but thank you. Yes?
Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm also in the tech industry, and I'm now a competitor. I look forward to it.
Excellent.
I did have a question. In addition to being the second to the worst state to do business in, we are the worst state to retire in. Out of those 144,000 taxpayers, a lot of them are looking to leave the state even though they don't want to. what are some incentivizations that you can think of to keep these people here? They want to stay.
Well, in the end, of course, it is about tax policy, isn't it? The reason that retirees leave is if they are in a position of capital gains, you just drive over to Nevada and Washington State, and you pay no capital gains. So that is a real economic incentive that people utilize. Listen, I have, on the campaign trail, people would come up to me and say, I used to be a full-time resident in California. Now I live in California for 5 months and 29 days, and I'm in Texas or Nevada or Washington for the remainder. So in the end, we have got to decide as a state that we would rather have a smaller percentage of something than 0%, than a higher percentage of nothing. And but again, my advice here would be, if we can begin to get economic growth, if we can begin to put our financials in place with a spending cap, we can build up a surplus, and then we can have a discussion about how we want to spend that money. Do we want to spend it on programs? Do we want to spend it on tax relief? Do we want to spend it on tax reform? Right now, look at the dialogue in Sacramento. We never even get to that point because it's all about, what next painful cut are we going to make to try to put a one-year fix on a budget. So in the end, those individuals are leaving for very real economic reasons. It's cheaper someplace else.
We have another question right here.
Hi, my name is David Saliveri. I was one of your volunteers. So thank you for running and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
There seems to be, I think, in the United States, especially in California, a movement against growth. You have NIMBY, you have environmentalists, you have the redistributionist model, and currently they're marching on Market Street in support of the folks marching on Wall Street. So how do you win the argument with this huge and growing, political and even, I would say, almost religious movement against growth?
Well, I tried, didn't I? It didn't actually work out that well. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I think we have to keep talking about it. I tried to reframe the argument in a way that really made sense to me in this speech today, which is that economic growth enables all things that people want from their government. If we do not get the economy growing, we are not going to be able to provide the services that we want. We are not going to be able to invest in education. So if we do not get this economy growing, nothing else is possible. And it has such a powerful effect. So the reason I'm going to continue to stay involved in public policy is I care tremendously about the future of this state. What happens to California impacts the country because we are such a huge percentage of the population and the GDP. So the only thing I know to do is to keep talking about it, to be out there, be explaining how I view this, how many business leaders view this. We want this state to succeed. Californians want this state to succeed. And the only thing I know how to do is keep talking about it. But I tried for 2.5 years and was not successful in sort of making that argument to a broad enough base of Californians. That I tried to show that there was a different way.
One more question. Yes.
It seems to me that even an 8th grader, California public school 8th grader, could look at the charts that you put up and reach the conclusions that would cause fundamental change. Yet the California legislature has been driving this economy towards a cliff for decades. You talk about a spending cap. I love it. You think it's real that we'll see that? What do you think the odds are that this legislature will take that on?
So I am always an optimist. And sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. And, but I am an optimist. I believe that with the right public pressure, with the right understanding, we have a real chance ultimately of getting this done. But I am not Pollyanna about it. But I think we've got to keep trying because you have a choice. Everyone has a choice. We could either, after the election, I could have sort of just, walked away and gone back to business or stay involved. And the reason I stayed involved is because it really matters. And I think there is a different way here. Now, I've got a different job and a different path, but I want to continue to talk about these issues because HP's future in California is intertwined. All of your businesses in California is intertwined, and we just have to keep trying to make this better. So I keep hoping that people in Sacramento will see a view. I mean, how great would it have been to have powered through the last 10 years with surpluses, have 2008, been basically we just powered right through, and we still would be talking about how we could invest in things we really wanted to invest in, as opposed to spending much of the last 8 years arguing about whether we're cutting teachers and increasing class sizes.
Well, you answered my last question, which was going to be, what are you going to be doing next in public policy in California? And it sounds like you're going to remain active. And one of our goals in having you here today was to make sure that you remain active, and you know that PPIC is a place where we enjoy the discussion of ideas. We think it's very important. And as I mentioned to you, I think it's hugely important that the business community in the state remains very active. And so on behalf of PPIC, and today we have, as well as the staff, our board members, along with Kim, we have Brigitte Bren and Donna Lucas are here joining us. So we have representatives from Silicon Valley, Southern California, and Sacramento. We really appreciate your taking the time here today. And for our audience, you're welcome to stay around and talk public policy and other things, of course. And thank you for taking the lunchtime to join us today. And I think this was just enormously useful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I hope
Thank you.
many more times.